Oh, great. Okay, we're recording now. Awesome. So there's a basement area. There are the arches that support the portico, and it's really cool to kind of go down underneath. Here's a picture of what it looks like underneath. And this is actually the latest group that I took in August. Yes, we did manage to go to Turkey and back again, all COVID-free. Thank you very much. That was awesome. So this was our group there. One of the really cool things about the portico basement, you see this water channel. They've cut it in there to remind us that what was in that basement right there was actually a cistern. So it would hold water. And they have also made this replica fountain right here because there used to be a wall in front of that cistern and the water would come out of it. And so when people wanted to get water, they could come down there, fill up their jugs, get water out of the fountain. And again, all of these things are things that the emperor has helped provide. The emperor gives water. The emperor helps rebuild the city. There are many reasons to be grateful for this wonderful empire that provides all these great things. So I'm pointing this out for a couple different reasons, because they're really interesting things in this basement. One of them is, and if you remember from last fall, I think I brought this image in before, there's an inscription. And the inscription, you can kind of see that in looking letter, Greek new, and can you see the epsilon there and the omega? Can you see these? Another letter that looks like a K, kappa. You've got the very famous now Omicron, so the short O. Then you've got the rho and the Omicron. So, oh, and then the sigma at the end. So all of these letters where he's pointing right here form the word neokoros. And so if you remember last fall, we were talking a lot about how it was a very huge honor for a city to be named a neokoros. Originally, that word meant temple sweeper, but it also came to be known as temple keeper, because this is the best analogy I have for you. You know how every 4 years we have Olympic Games somewhere, and there's cities across the world that are vying for the honor to host these Olympic Games, right? Huge honor, big economic boost. Well, kind of like that back then. They used to have competitions to be the person who would host an imperial temple. So who's going to get the honor to build the temple? And the good thing about the temple rather than the Olympics is that it stays there, right? So once you get that temple, you've got all kinds of pilgrims who are going to come to that temple to worship the emperor and his family. So huge point of civic pride, great economic boost for the city. And the city that hosts the temple of the emperor, that keeps it, they are the temple sweeper, the temple keeper, is called a neokoros. So it's a huge honor to get this title. And so here is an inscription, and it's really interesting. This is from after the time of John, but they are boasting that Smyrna was 3 times neokoros. And the reason why they're boasting this is because their 2 biggest civic rivals are the city of Ephesus to the south and the city of Pergamum to the north. And those 2 cities, by the time they were writing this inscription, had only been a neokoros twice, but Smyrna had gotten it 3 times. So they're basically saying, stick it to you. We got it 3 times. You've only gotten the imperial temple twice. By the time of John, there was only 1 imperial temple there, but that's enough to tick John off and upset the early Christians. By the time this inscription was done, this is during the time of Caracalla, they had 3. And actually, it's really cool. Like, love ancient coins. We can learn a lot from them. Their imagery helps us know so many different things. And in this case, this was a coin that was minted during the time of Caracalla. And you can see on the back side of it, 3 little temples, right? And so it's talking about the 3 little temples that were in Smyrna. The first one was to Augustus, and they were actually the 2nd city that had the honor of building an imperial temple to the deceased Augustus. Pergamum got the first one, so they did have that point of pride, but Smyrna got the 2nd one. And then later on, after the time of John and Revelation, they would get 2 more temples. They did like to point out to everybody, though, that they were the first city in Asia to erect a temple to the cult of the goddess Roma. So they did get that first honor. And they like to brag about being the first in Asia. So again, huge civic competitions between these cities. And here it is, another coin that is bragging about, that fact. So here we get a picture of the goddess Roma. reclining on, and I brought this in the fall too. Can you see what she's reclining on? If you can, unmute and tell me. Anybody? Nope, you guys are all shy. That's okay.
Is it a hand?
It kind of looks like that, doesn't it? But count what you see there. Is it just 5?
The hills of Rome. 6, 7. The 7 hills of Rome.
Yes, very good. All right. So not a hand because there's 7 there. She's reclining on the 7 hills of Rome because, as everybody knows, Rome is a city that's built on 7 hills. Now, my friends, we won't really get into the rest of Revelation, but do you remember that later on there is a harlot who is riding on a 7-headed beast? Just saying, this is likely the imagery that this is coming from. So, I mean, you can see how these might look like heads and how, well, it's not just impolite to be calling the city of Rome or the goddess Roma harlot, but also a tactical error in terms of whether or not you are loyal to the empire. But so a lot of the imagery in Rome is treasonous, is the best way to put it. So anyway, this is an image of the goddess Roma. They had a temple to the goddess Roma. In fact, Cicero wrote somewhere that Smyrna is one of our biggest allies. So very pro-Roman city, tons of imperial temples. Just want you to remember that they got along well with Rome. Now, something else that's in the basement of this city, which is super cool and has just been excavated in the last few years, is an underground graffiti salon. Doesn't that sound very fancy? So again, still, we're in the arches that are underneath the portico, walking under there. And once you, so you can imagine, like, all of the people who are trying to get out of the hot sun, it helps to walk through those arches. Yes, one of them was a cistern. You couldn't walk back there, but other ones would be passageways that would help you walk in the shade and avoid the hot sun. And so when you have think about like walking under a bridge today. If we are walking under like a highway bridge, I mean, what happens there? We walk along the one on Front Street all the time. And what happens there over time? Graffiti, right? We keep painting over it. People keep putting graffiti there. I don't know why, but this has been happening for millennia. People have liked to do graffiti. And you can see in this particular picture, kind of part of a boat there, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. So they also did inscriptions. I have yet to go to Pompeii. I hope to one day. Some of you may have already been there before. I'm told that's amazing to see their graffiti because, of course, everything was frozen in that one moment of time from the horrible volcanic eruption. But here, it's not just one moment of time. It wasn't frozen in there. We've got lots of different time periods. And what's really cool is that we think we have, so far, the earliest Christian graffiti. So there's an inscription down there that talks about to the one who has given the Spirit. And so scholars think that this is probably one of the earliest examples of Christian graffiti. And the function of the graffiti, they think, was just to announce that Christians were in the city so that other believers could find them and fellowship and worship. So that's what they're thinking right now and how they're interpreting this. So that's pretty cool. And keep in mind that the graffiti talked about the one who is given the Spirit, because I think that also has something to do with the interpretation later on. And just in case you're wondering, they're announcing that they're Christians in the city. Did you ever wonder how they got there in the first place? Like, how did Christians get to Smyrna? I mean, we know a bit about Ephesus. We know that Paul visited there, right? And he camps out there for 2 to 3 years teaching. But how did Christianity come to Smyrna? Was it Paul? Possibly. There is an early Christian legend that's recorded in the Acts of John. So this is an extra canonical book, apocryphal book that is called Acts of John according to Prochorus. We talked about this guy before. You can see him in the icons. Actually, I brought some of my icons too. So I have a version of this as well that I brought back from the island of Patmos. And if you go to the island of Patmos, you're going to see icons like this all over. And Prochorus was actually a biblical person. We just don't really think about the name a lot. He was one of the 7 deacons that was appointed in Acts to take care of the Gentile widows, if you remember that bit. Probably the guy's name that you do remember from that list of 7 is Stephen, because he becomes the first martyr. So Stephen, Prochorus, guy named Nicholas, who we think also appears in Revelation. We'll get to that with another city. So he's one of the ones mentioned there. And so according to Christian tradition, he was the scribe of John. So maybe even the person who's writing down Revelation. So you always see him in these icons as the young guy who's writing stuff down for the older John, who's obviously getting the vision from heaven, right? So according to the Acts of John, written by Prochorus, there's some really interesting stories. I won't get into all of them, but according to this story, the way that Christianity got to Smyrna was because people in Smyrna heard that John was over in Ephesus. He also hung out there just like Paul. And they send a delegation to him. And basically they say, come and tell us in Smyrna this good news that you've been telling to all these other regions. And so John comes and he preaches. And so according to this book, anyway, that's how Christianity gets there. Could have come in a number of different ways, but that's an early Christian legend. So I'm going to pause right here. We're kind of at the midpoint, and we're going to start talking about the interpretation of the letter itself. But I want to see if any of you guys had questions about the city or anything that I've already shared. So let me pause and maybe have a few moments of interaction with you guys, because I can actually see you. Did I mention that? I finally figured out how I can see you and see my PowerPoint at the same time. It only took 2 years on Zoom, but I finally figured it out. So this is exciting.
Well, Meg, it's wonderful to remember the trip and to pull out my brochure, from our trip, Biblical Turkey. We just had a wonderful time. I would love to go on every trip. And I have my icons here in the living room. And it was just an amazing, I never thought I would walk on Roman roads that Paul walked on, and see all these early churches and and understand more about just the small number of Christians at the time. That there weren't thousands and thousands, right? I mean, I just
at the beginning.
Yeah. So anyway, it was very wonderful. Yeah.
Does anybody else have any questions they'd like me to answer? Okay. You sure? Last chance. All right, we'll keep moving on then. So if you'd like to, you can open up your Bibles. If you have it with you, you can turn to Revelation 2, verses 8 through 11. I will also put most of the text on screen if you don't. I know last fall I had given out kind of a handout that you can also use and follow along with. Gosh, that's a good question. I should put it in here real quick for everybody else who didn't get that. So you guys take a little break for a second. I will pull that up just so everybody can get it. I don't want you guys to miss out. I'll drop it in the chat just in case you want it. But any questions while I'm looking for that? Only take me a second. Okay, I am dropping it over here in the chat. Did it come through? Yes, possibly.
Yes, it came through.
Okay, awesome. All right, so that's there if you want to use that. Sorry, I didn't resend that out before this, but you can always print it out or pull it up if that helps, and follow along and kind of take notes as we go through this text together. So, all right, one thing that we talked about last fall, and I need to update this. This is an older PowerPoint. We talked about how there are recurring elements of the letter form that is used to the 7 churches in Revelation. So we're going to look at those. So the first part is just like any good writing, any good letter. we always have an introduction, right? So that's the first section. Then we'll have a body of the letter, and then we'll have a conclusion of the letter. And then under those three headings, we have smaller bits. The first bit is you're always going to have a church recipient. So on the handout, it says the church that they're writing to and the recipient. And so this one's pretty easy. It says, to the angel of the church in Smyrna, write. And this is formulaic. It's repeated in all 7. And then what you have after that is a descriptive statement of Christ. It's going to say, these are the words of, and then you're going to get a description of Jesus that comes from chapter 1. So there is this opening vision that John had, and we talked about that some in the fall. And in that vision and what Jesus says there, John is going to draw some aspect of that vision. Usually there are 2 things that come out of there used to describe Jesus. And in this instance, what he uses to describe Jesus to the church in Smyrna is, these are the words of the one who is the first and the last, who died and came back to life. Okay. Here is the opening vision. And I've used our good friends, the Lego Bible, the Brick Testament, if you've seen it before, because I always think it's so funny what they do. But this is what it said in the opening vision. But he placed his right hand on me, saying, do not be afraid. I am the first and the last and the living one. I was dead, and see, I am alive forever. And I have the keys of death and of Hades. Now, first of all, I think this is really interesting. Anytime an angel appears in scripture, the first thing that they almost always tell people is don't be afraid, because that's got to be super scary. But the same sort of thing, if you're having this crazy apocalyptic vision, one of the first things Jesus says is don't be afraid. And how does he comfort them? In this case, John, he tells them, I am the first and the last, the living one. I was dead, and see, I'm alive forever and ever. So it's interesting that those are the words that he uses to comfort and calm John when he's getting this vision, but they are also the words that he uses to comfort and calm the church in Smyrna. There's several different things here that I think are really interesting. First, the first and the last, let's talk about that one, because it's quite high Christology. And that's just a very fancy way. Christology literally means a word about Jesus. So it's a teaching about Christ, right? And we say it's high Christology because here he's being connected with God. Because in Revelation at the very beginning, God is referred to as the Alpha, the first letter of the Greek alphabet, and the Omega, the last letter of the Greek alphabet. So Jesus here is being referred to as the first and the last. I mean, it's basically a literary device that where you talk about 2 aspects of something to cover the entirety of it. So like I have a friend who's used the analogy of somebody talks about a bumper to bumper warranty. It's talking about covering the whole car, and they're just using the 2 ends of it. Right? So in this case, first and last is talking about the person who's been there for all of time, right? Now, some scholars say that what they think is comforting about this is they think it's a reference to the sovereignty of God. We can get into a whole debate about that. And they think he's talking about time because he's talking about who's in control or in charge of all of time. Possibly, it could also simply be the fact that I have been here forever. I'm going to be here forever. I have seen everything, and I have been, what I think is the key, present for it all. Because I think the comforting message to many of the churches is Christ's presence, always there, not going away, seen it, done it all, right? Been there, done that. And the fact that he's been there and done that, what he specifically points out is he's the one who has died and come back to life, right? So God in the beginning of Revelation is referred to as the one who is and who was and who is to come. So again, always there, right? The great I am, the being, the existence that's just there. And Jesus is referred to as the one who is dead and came back to life, or sometimes referred to as the firstborn among the dead. Now, why would that be particularly comforting to Smyrna? We're going to find out later in the letter. But again, I think In the letter to Ephesus, what was pointed out as the description of Jesus was he was the one who was walking amongst the lampstands, and the lampstands represent the churches. So he is there present among them. Same sort of thing. He's present, but in a sense that, time doesn't matter. Like if you're the person who's always been there, like death and life, ruler of all of that, existing for all of that, like it's a very big view on everything, but it's also talking about just present for everything. And when you think of things from those very global, eternal terms, everything else that happens kind of, it shrinks in comparison, right? I don't know. So I think that's kind of the point, is to give them comfort from a very eternal perspective and a message of hope, because if he's been there, done that, died and came back to life, there's hope that other people will too, right? So it's a message of hope. So, and I put this up here because I thought Susanna would especially like it too. So I have my own little, it's called the Anastasis icon in Greek, which just means resurrection. So here's mine. But you'll see in these descriptions, depictions, you always have Jesus here as the one who's come back to life and who is also grabbing the people who are in their tombs. You can see they're in their coffins there, sarcophagus, if you prefer, and pulling them out of death. So it's this idea of Jesus, descending into, in Peter's letters, he talks about descending into hell, like descending into Hades is literally what it is, and bringing up those from the dead. So I just think it's interesting that the image in the church that's used to represent the resurrection of Jesus isn't just Jesus alone. It's usually Jesus bringing others back from the dead with him. So, it's kind of a message of hope even in that icon. So I think about that icon when I think about the church in Smyrna. And then moving on to the body of the letter, we're going to see again what the descriptive statement is. It's like a thesis, because whatever he's used in that descriptive statement is going to be because he's going to talk about something related to it in the body of the letter. So think of it as a thesis. So let's see what we get. And in most of the letters, what we find in the body is compliments and or complaints. And then we also get what's going to happen, the conclusions, if you want to call it that, the warnings, if you keep heading down the path that you're on, and the promises of if you shift in a different direction and do good things instead. This is prophecy. This is basic prophecy 101, right? It is always talking about what happens if you stay on that path, bad things or good things if you change direction. So, and as we talked about in the fall, Revelation is definitely one of its genres is prophecy. So that's what the main body of the letter has to talk about. And so first we're going to start with compliments. And the first thing that we're told about the church in Smyrna is, I know your hardship and poverty, though you are actually rich. Okay. They are complimented basically for their endurance. They have been enduring both economic and some type of, could be social deprivation. We don't exactly know what the hardship was, but out of all the 7 churches of Revelation, this is the only one where they mention specifically economic persecution, hardship that they're undergoing. And what could be happening there? A number of different things, right? If you live in a city that has a neokoros that worships the emperor, and you are not willing to participate in that because you believe there is only one God, there is only one Lord, and it's not Caesar. You're not just making a religious statement, you're making a political statement, and it's a treasonous one, really, if you're not willing to worship the emperor. And so if you're not willing to do that, all kinds of economic hardship could happen. For one, if you really are declared a traitor, your property gets seized, right? So that's possibly what's happened. We hear about that happening. I think it's in Acts where some believers lose their property. Other things that could happen if you're a member of a trade guild, and those are very important back then, you get business through the trade guild. And so if you get blackballed from your guild, how can you get business anymore? And in order to be a part of the guild, they had guild halls. And so they would go and have banquets together, and always part of the banquet, there are political and religious parts too. So it might be just offering some incense to the emperor. It might be basically saying a pledge to the empire beforehand. And if you don't feel like you can participate in those things, you're out of the guild. You can't go to the guild hall anymore. So it could be that. It could just be, well, we don't experience this quite as much here in Western countries, but Christians in other parts of the world, it's really interesting when they apply for jobs. Sometimes you have to list what your religious affiliation is. I had friends on the last trip that I took to Turkey who were from Egypt originally, and they've since immigrated to the US. And one of the reasons they left was because they couldn't get work, because on everything they had to list that they were Christians. And so they would literally be blackballed from getting work because of that. I don't want to go to the Christian doctor. I would rather go to, especially if it's my wife, they were OBGYNs. So they're like, do I want to send my wife to a Christian doctor? No, I want to send her to a Muslim doctor. So even things like that still happen. And this may have been what was going on back then. So whatever it was their faith that was causing them to experience some kind of economic hardship. Now, they again are complimented for something else. I know the hurtful things that have been spoken about you by those who say they are Jews, though they are not, but are really Satan's synagogue. Okay. John is known for having some really harsh language. Like if you go back and read John's gospel, it's really harsh language for his enemies, and some that seems very anti-Semitic. So John gets accused of being very anti-Semitic. One thing I would say about that is John himself is Jewish. So for him, I think in his mind, he is talking to his fellow Jews. So it's not that he hates a people group, it's his people group. It's that he hates what they're doing. And one of the reasons I think that he uses this term is if you go back into the Old Testament and you look at the original meaning of Satan, Hasatan is the word, it's Hebrew, that means the accuser. And if you go back to a book like Job, what does Satan do in the book of Job? He accuses, stands before God and says, oh, this person, that person, they're doing this sort of thing. And what we think is going on here, and possibly this reference to Satan here, is that the Jews who are being accused here by John are saying hurtful things about the Christians. Now, we don't know exactly what those things are. It could just be gossip and bad mouthing, but I seriously doubt it was just that. There were people in the Roman Empire that were known as, I forget the technical term for it, but basically they reported on others, and it is entirely possible that that is what is going on here. Just a bit of a background. Originally, people saw Christians as just this minor sect within Judaism, right? They are just Jews who are following Jesus as their Messiah, but it's this fringe, strange group, but under the umbrella of Judaism, right? So as long as the Christians are under that umbrella, they get some benefits because Jews were exempt from doing things like worshiping the emperor. So everybody knew the Jews weren't going to do that, and that's okay. The emperor said they don't have to. You don't have to have statues of the emperor in your temple. You don't actually have to pay certain taxes to the emperor. You can pay that tax to the temple. They had a temple tax that they paid. But after the Jews revolted, you may remember in 70 AD CE, that was the end of the Jewish temple because the Romans come in to suppress the rebellion, burn the city of Jerusalem, destroy the temple. And after that, after you've led a treasonous rebellion against Rome, you're not getting some of the same privileges. So like that temple tax that you're allowed to send, they make them start sending it to Rome instead to help build a new temple to Saturn. That's like the worst thing you can make a Jewish person do, is to help fund a pagan temple, right? So they're already in hot water with the Roman Empire, and they definitely don't want to be associated with these Christians who seem quite treasonous in what they're doing. They don't want that. So they would probably want to do anything they can to separate themselves, maybe including denouncing them to the authorities. So that's possibly what's going on here. I mean, obviously we don't know exactly because it's very general speculation, but it's entirely possible. About, I'd say, a generation after John's writing this, we do get one of the earliest references to Christians outside of the New Testament. And it's in this letter that Pliny the Younger, if you've ever heard of him before, he was basically the ruler of Pontus and Bithynia. So this is in the north of Asia Minor in what is today Turkey. And he writes to the Emperor Trajan to ask him for advice about, what do I do with these Christians? I'm going to tell you what I did with them. This is how I handled the situation. And you tell me if you think this is good. So basically, he had people who were denouncing Christians. So like coming and telling him, these guys are Christians. And so, again, Christians were accused of a lot of things back then. One of them, again, was being treasonous because you wouldn't worship the emperor. They were also accused of being atheist. Now, I mean, Rome didn't have any problem with whatever God you want to worship, so long as they're not leading a revolt. They did have a problem in the society for people who didn't believe that there was more than one God. That just seemed weird. And so they called people who didn't believe in more than one God an atheist. So they get that title. They're accused of being incestuous because they always talk about being brothers and sisters in Christ, and they greet one another with a holy kiss. And some of these brothers and sisters are actually married. Like if you're referring to your spouse as your brother in Christ, weird. So incestuous. They were accused of cannibalism because they're talking about eating the body of Christ and drinking the blood. So they're accused of all these things. So when you got reported as being a Christian, there are all these things in the background of what everybody thought about you. So if they get reported to Pliny and he has to do something about it, he tells Emperor Trajan that this is what I did. I had them come in. I gave them the opportunity to say that they weren't Christians. I gave them the opportunity to prove it by worshiping you, oh great emperor. You know, all you got to basically say is Caesar's Lord, drop a little incense. I'll let you go because you know, I can't take the word of, you know, some people who reported you. I need to know for sure if you are. And he said, it said that anyone who's a true Christian would never do that, you know? So those who refuse to worship you and refuse to recant their beliefs, he ends up killing them. So basically, he didn't really want to have to deal with that. And the emperor says it's a really bad precedent for people to be reporting on one another. And especially if they're posting anonymous lists of people, this is not a good environment to live in. So he basically establishes the first don't ask, don't tell policy. And he's like, look, don't go seeking them out to persecute them. But if other people tell you who they are, then yeah, you got to do something about it. So all this to say, we have this example from just a generation later of what's going on and of people reporting Christians and what Pliny is doing about it and getting the seal of approval from Trajan. So it's entirely likely that this is something similar happening here. So you get reported, they put you in prison, which by the way, was only temporary because it's just till your trial. And after your trial, you're either going to be innocent or you're going to be guilty. And if you're guilty, they're probably going to kill you because who wants the expense of keeping prisoners? They didn't do that back then. Or if you're really lucky and really rich, maybe they'll exile you and banish you. But probably those two things are going to happen. So this is why he's calling them possibly Satan's synagogue, because they're reporting on them. Some people think that maybe the reason they're being called that is they're saying you who say you're Jews, but you're not, because maybe they too had started worshiping the emperor and betraying their own monotheism and their own faith. And so maybe it's you say that, you know, I'm not Jewish anymore, you know, but you are the guys, if you're worshiping the emperor, who really aren't Jewish anymore. So you're not really a part of the synagogue, the gathering together. Lots of different interpretations of this. Again, as you can see, we don't have a lot to go on, just the context of what else we know is happening back then. So anyway, they get a compliment. They have endured economic, perhaps social deprivation, slander. And then we hear about, I just mentioned arrest back then. Don't be afraid of what you're going to suffer. Look, the devil is going to throw some of you into prison in order to test you. You will suffer hardship for 10 days. Okay. So clearly they're afraid that they're going to get arrested for being Christians. So, and that kind of goes with what we were just talking about. The 10 days, most people think that it is just a symbol. I mean, 10 is symbolic throughout the book of Revelation. It's just a period of time. There's a minority of scholars who think it might be literal, might have something to do with games, because usually they would post an announcement like, we are going to have the gladiatorial games for a period of, it usually says how many days. So this way of speaking sounds almost kind of like that, announcing for a period of 10 days, we're going to have games. And we also know from other examples that during these games is when they would execute criminals, and usually in a way that would entertain the crowd, because entertainment back then was throwing them to wild animals, burning them alive, having them fight as gladiators. So all kinds of things were happening back then. So they're going to be thrown into prison. And if you get thrown into prison, it's quite likely that you may end up in the arena. So some people think that maybe it's an allusion to the arena. Some people just think it's referring to a period of testing and trouble that's going on. So that's the compliments. Now we turn to the complaints. You guys tell me, what are the complaints in this letter? I need to drink a glass of water.
I don't see a complaint, Meg. I mean, what I see is this understanding that there's going to be suffering, maybe likely for some to death. Yeah. And what's interesting is John's not praying against that. Mm-hmm. There's no prayer here of God, save them from this, you know?
No, you don't get that.
That we're really missing that. And I just want to say, considering that you're telling these people this terrible, terrible news, I think it'd be a pretty low ball to complain about.
Well, and you're right. It was a trick question, because there are no complaints, none, zip, zero, nothing. We can celebrate. Like Smyrna and Philadelphia are the only two cities that get no complaints. So we can kind of skip that part. This is why it's also a shorter letter, by the way. Instead, we can move on to the part where we get the warnings and promises. And since there were no complaints, there are no warnings. So we can skip that part too. We go straight to the promise. And it says, be faithful even to the point of death, and I will give you the crown of life. Okay. Now, my friends, crown, there are two different types of crowns. One of them was the diadem that the royals would wear, right? And then the other kind was a victory wreath. We brought a couple of these back from Greece last time. So you like those? You can see they had different kinds of leaves that they would use, because each god or goddess was represented by some kind of tree, bush. I mean, it could be anything from an oak tree to celery, seriously. And the wreaths that they would get depended on the games, because the games are always dedicated to a different god. And so whatever your victory wreath was usually the leaves of that god. So you would get the crown. I mean, we still have this kind of in the Olympics today. I mean, they're usually medals, but back then it was a crown. And of course, since it's made out of these leaves, it wasn't metal like that one I just showed you. It would die. We have the same sort of imagery in Paul, where he talks about getting the imperishable crown, the crown that will not perish, because those victory wreaths, they wilt and die eventually. But the crown I'm going to give you is going to be there forever. And so here it's this crown of life. And so I think it's interesting because, by the way, this is one of my students who is pointing out for you what's happening here. This is an inscription of one guy who had won all these different competitions. So each wreath represents one of the different athletic competitions they won, because they were as crazy about sports back then as people are today. You know, they love to watch them. They love to compete. They love to brag about how many, you know, different competitions they've won. And this is a coin of Smyrna that has a wreath on it. A crown, same word. It's called Stephanos. That's when we talked about Stephen earlier. That name just means, you know, crowned one. So the crown was a symbol of Smyrna as well. We talked about the top of the Acropolis being referred to as a crown. So there are many different references to Smyrna being a crown. So yeah, I just think it's interesting. You don't fight for the crown that perishes, but you look to the crown of life. But it's interesting here too, because it's not that be faithful even to the point of death, and you will win the crown of life. Basically, it's going to come back up in a minute, because in the conclusion, where we have the concluding exhortation, which always just says, let anyone who has an ear to listen, what the Spirit is saying to the churches, and then you get the promise. So if you listen, really good listener, and by the way, that's one of the biggest complaints in the Old Testament of Israelites, is that they didn't listen. I mean, that's like the biggest thing you hear is listen, listen, listen. The concluding exhortation and the eschatological promise that you get, or the conquering promise, that's what you'll see it called in the booklet. Let anyone who has an ear listen to the Spirit, to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. Those who emerge victorious won't be hurt by the second death. Now, victory, the word in Greek is Nike, the swish symbol, Nike, that's where it comes from. There was a goddess Nike. So we hear a lot of victorious language in Revelation, but it's not being victorious like a army conquering. It's being victorious by just being faithful. Like that's how you're victorious, is being faithful, even to the point of death, as we were just told. They won't be hurt by the second death. Opens up a whole can of worms. What is the second death? So if we look in some of the rabbinic literature, the second death, the first death is the natural one. Everybody dies. The second death refers to the judgment of God. You won't be hurt by that second death. Some people think death as in the sense of total annihilation death. That's a whole other debate. You can have somebody else come and talk to you. I would recommend having Sharon come. See, I was about to say Sharon Putt. It is Putt now. Yes. So Sharon Putt, have her come. If she hasn't come already, she can talk about that, whether it's annihilation or whether it's, suffering forever. But those who emerge victorious won't be hurt by the second death. And I think it's a really interesting one because, and I haven't mentioned this before, but the word Smyrna in Greek actually is the same word as myrrh. And you'll remember that's that sweet smelling spice in which the dead bodies were wrapped. Jesus is wrapped in myrrh. Jesus gets myrrh when he's a baby. It's one of the three gifts. And there's several mourning myths that are also associated with Smyrna. Also, some of the most famous martyrdoms in the church history took place in Smyrna. And I'm going to tell you about one of those at the end. So, Smyrna was literally the city of life and death. It's the one that was destroyed for 300 years and reborn like a phoenix from the ashes. So I think there are just so many images of death that are associated with this city. And one of them, I'm going to tell you this. This is after the time of John, not too long. So he was actually... he is someone who is said to have basically studied at the feet of John. His name is St. Polycarp. And if you go to Izmir today, you can even see St. Polycarp's church. It's pictured here. And by the way, this city of life and death out of the 7 is the only one that still has a church that is alive today in Turkey. There are no other Christian churches in any of the other 6. This one has several. So this city still has churches that are alive. And one of them is named after St. Polycarp. And St. Polycarp, again, here's another, this is extra canonical literature. So the story of St. Polycarp is basically that he lived between 69 and 156 CE. So this is kind of contemporary with John, but a bit younger generation. He was appointed as the bishop of Smyrna, converted by John himself, according to the legend. And basically there was a game. We talked about the gladiatorial game that was happening, and a Christian was put to death and the crowd wasn't entertained enough. And so they start yelling, bring us Polycarp, bring us Polycarp. And so his friends tell him to get out of town. He starts leaving and then he decides, no, I can't do that. So he comes back and they get him, they put him in prison, they bring him out into the arena. And the first thing that they try to do, if you go to the church today, beautiful. It's got all these panels that even talk about the life of Polycarp. The first thing that they try to do is they decide that they're going to burn him to death in the middle of the arena. And then according to the legend here, when they try to burn him, like the flames billow around him like a billowing sail and won't even touch him. And so it's like miraculous, he won't even burn. So then somebody else goes and gets a dagger and stabs him, and that's what kills him. They end up burning his body anyway, because they don't want there to be any relics. Get Susanna to talk to you about relics and why they were important. So they don't want there to be any relics of this saint. And they don't want the Christians to collect his remains. But I think one of the most telling things about Polycarp is in the story, when he is brought before the ruler, he is given the chance to recant. We talked about that earlier, right? So what Emperor Trajan is advising Pliny to do when he's governor. So give him the chance to recant. And so they tell him, just basically worship the emperor, just recant if you will. And he answers back, he says, for 86 years, I have been his servant and he has never done me wrong. How can I blaspheme my king who has saved me? And so that's his response when he's asked to recant. And so instead, he ends up giving his life. And then in the church, you've got a depiction of St. Polycarp in glory with his Lord. So I think the story of Polycarp just goes perfectly with this letter that we get to the Christians in Smyrna who were facing imprisonment and likely even death. But they're promised that you have someone who has been through that death before, who is alive now, and you will have that crown of victory, that crown of life, and you have nothing basically to worry about. It's temporary. It only lasts, and on the other side is something even more glorious. And so I think this letter to Christians who are facing that would definitely be a letter of comfort and encouragement, because you can control a lot of things in life, but that ain't one of them, right? So I will stop there. Give it over to Father David. I know we're out of time, but if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to stay.
Are there any questions for Meg? Well, we look forward to next week with Pergamum, as we kind of build some cases. I always thought I wouldn't want to serve the church in Laodicea. It's not a really great place, but Smyrna, maybe not so bad. We'll see. Anyway, let's close out with a little bit of prayer. Gracious God, we thank you for the fascinating things you've shown us today. And we thank you for your love within it that's been revealed to us, and for the love that we share together as your body in our own time. As we leave our time together, we thank you that you walk with us, and may we always be alert to your promptings and live within your endless love. For indeed, yours is the kingdom, the power, and the glory in this age, in ages past, and forevermore. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Thank you for being with us, folks.
Thank you. Good to see you all.
We'll see you next week.
Yes.